everybody, what's up? Chad Wesley Smith here for Juggernaut Training Systems, joined by Dr. Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization. Today we're going to start a new series where we go through the scientific principles of strength training, a book that we co-authored along with Dr. James Hoffman, and dissect different popular programs based on the different principles. So we're going to start with Westside. Now I know you're probably thinking, Chad Wesley Smith, notorious Westside hater, but we have positive things to say, we have negative things to say, and we're going to let the viewers decide for themselves if they think it's a good program. So, let's get right into it. The first thing we want to talk about is specificity. Specificity creates an umbrella for all other programming decisions to be made. If you're violating specificity, it's going to be very tough to have an effective program.
A really good thing with specificity is, of course, the sport of powerlifting is all about lifting really, really heavy. And Westside scores pretty big in the fact that it consistently, in fact year-round, has heavy lifting. One thing that will never surprise somebody who trains in the Westside method is heavy weight. And because there are other systems we could critique really, consistently for kind of staying away from heavy weight, and there's other training systems in which, you're taking sets of fives all the time you get to the meet, and the singles crush you. With Westside, lots of triples, lots of singles, really, really heavy. So the specificity on the side of getting used to really heavy stimulus all the time, really it is there, and that's a really good version, or a good facet of the program for sure. Yeah.
So before we get into the negative, the bad part of specificity in regards to Westside, it's important to note that Westside is a conjugate or a concurrent system of training, but not all conjugate or concurrent systems of training are Westside. And people who are really big fans of Westside may be watching this and disagree with some of the things we say in regards to exercise, the exercises we're crediting towards Westside or the types of training, saying, Westside isn't all bands and chains, or Westside isn't all box squats. But when Louis says things in articles like we do 90% of our squats to a box, if you're not doing 75% or 50% or any percent of your squats to a box, you could still be doing a conjugate or concurrent method of training, but in my opinion, that would cease to be Westside. And that's for specificity where most of the problems with Westside are going to lie, is in improper exercise selection. So for multiply powerlifting, great exercise selection. Very, very important that they overload the top end with bands and chains, with partial range of motion movements like board presses and rack pulls. Extremely important. The act of squatting in a suit and benching in a shirt are going to focus on different muscles. Different muscles are going to drive those lifts. They're going to drive the raw squat and the raw bench. And deadlift's still very similar. But for the raw squat, it's so much about sitting back into the suit. That's what's going to help get the most out of the suit. So it becomes a very hamstring, hip dominant movement. But without that suit there, it's very difficult for someone to squat in that same style of technique, or in that same technique raw.
It just wouldn't be productive raw.
Yeah, it wouldn't be productive, and it probably wouldn't be sustainable to squat in an ultra-wide stance without the hip protection of briefs and a suit. So you're going to see the best raw squatters in the world squatting with a, not necessarily a narrow stance, but a narrower stance than you're going to see the best multiply lifters squatting with. Squatting consistently to deeper standard because of the raw judging is just tighter than multiply judging. And in doing that, the muscles that are going to drive poundages in the squat,
and the limiting factor muscles, in fact,
are going to shift from the hamstrings and hips to the quads. The quads are what drive big raw squats. Look at people who have big raw squats. Myself, Ray Williams, Dan Green, Kevin Oak. All of these guys, huge quads. Derek Kendall. So the quads are going to be very, very important in driving the poundages up on the raw squat. And a real Westside system really neglects those muscles. So it's not training the right muscles. Same thing, same idea in the bench. Shirted bench pressing, huge emphasis on the lats for stability, for being able to get the bar to actually touch your chest, and then huge emphasis on the triceps. Because the shirt is providing so much support in the bottom end of the lift, Westside and multiply lifters tend to neglect training the pecs, direct training to the delts, and those are going to be muscles that are hugely important in driving the raw bench press. So if you're doing a true Westside system, what I would consider a true Westside system, lots of partial range work, tons and tons of exercises directed at the triceps, with very little work being done directly for the chest and shoulders, you're going to be neglecting the muscles that are probably most important to your success in the raw bench.
Yeah, and can you adapt a conjugate concurrent system to train those muscles? Totally, but that's really not Westside anymore.
Yeah.
At some point ceases to be anything like Westside. Yeah.
The bad parts of specificity we mostly covered in exercise selection. Too much emphasis on partial range of movement, box squats. Some people love box squats. I think you'd be hard pressed to find very many top raw lifters, save the example of, well, I saw that this guy did it, or my friend's squat went up a lot and he was doing box squats. If we're looking at the preponderance of evidence, the top 100 raw squatters in the world, you're going to be very hard pressed to find a lot of guys who are heavily utilizing the box squat. Is it a great teaching tool? Sure. Is it a great tool for team sport athletes? Definitely. Is it a great tool to drive weight up in the raw squat? Not in my opinion.
Probably not.
Then the last thing is going to be accommodating resistance in regards to specificity. So bands and chains. Bands and chains is a huge contribution of Westside to the strength and conditioning field. A lot of strong applications for them. For the raw lifter, probably not the best decision. They're challenging you in the top part of the movement where very few raw lifters are going to struggle. So they're allowing the most difficult part of the movement, bottom of the squat, off the chest and the bench, to be easier, and that's really where you need to be putting the bulk of your attention to improve.
Yeah, is there a place potentially, especially for some guys with really big chests and really maybe even strong triceps but a poor technical ability lockout, is there potential for bands and chains to use? Yes, as a short-term tool for variation, not as a meat and potatoes staple, is something that, here we're squatting, are we going to use bands or chains today? And the idea of not using accommodating resistance is what kind of trick is that? In raw powerlifting training, accommodating resistance is the new trick that you use every now and again. Mm-hmm. In Westside, it is the meat and potatoes, and raw lifting really is the trick at some point. So.
Yeah. And I have extensive experience training in a Westside style. I was all about Westside when I was throwing the shot put, and very early in my career as a coach. And something I always found benching with bands or chains is that it was extremely stressful to my shoulders. I mean, a lot of bicep tendonitis. That could be something that's just unique to me. But if it's something that you've also struggled with trying to use accommodating resistance, it may not be the most sustainable training strategy for you.
Overload is the second most important training principle, and Westside is a system which allows for very heavy training, regular heavy training. As a matter of fact, more or less every week, you get at least 2 sessions, or one for upper, one for lower, where you are putting in some very, very serious overload. And that's a very good thing as far as increasing especially your limit strength. There are some critiques we can make in other principles for general strength for hypertrophy, but in that sense, because Westside really prizes heavy lifting relatively frequently, that on that it gets a very good pass. There's a certain minimum intensity you need to progress to get stronger. Westside for sure hits that, and even the dynamic effort work often exceeds the minimum intensity for strength gains. The problem is there's not only a minimum intensity, there's a minimum volume. If you decided that you want to do 1 single a week in the squat to try to get stronger, it doesn't matter if that single is 105% of your max. Outside of very, very new people, you're not going to get stronger just doing 1 single a week. So yes, there is a minimum intensity threshold, but there's also a minimum volume threshold. Westside, for most lifters, in most circumstances, unless you're absolutely gigantic and already very well muscularly developed, doesn't have enough volume. So it scores poorly on overload for volume. Yeah, it's great that they're training heavy, but there should be more heavy work because most lifters can recover from much more than Westside prescribes. A couple of 1 max triple sometimes on the squat is all you'll take, or 1 you work up to a single and then it's a little easy assistance work. It's usually not enough volume, and that comes into play both in strength development. It's not enough volume to develop a lot of strength, lots of sets of 5 or something. That's how you really get strong. And it's definitely not enough volume to develop hypertrophy. So Westside suffers in that regard. And I remember when I was coming up, back when I was a powerlifter, and I was a raw lifter back in the equipped heyday, 2005 to 2010, around there. And I remember a lot of us beginners who tried to run Westside templates, etc., would really struggle with developing muscle size. We had no idea how everyone got that big because we wouldn't get sore, we wouldn't get a pump, we wouldn't get anything. It would be like you're just really trying really hard and you kind of have sore elbows and shoulders and then the workout's over. And we would have benefited greatly, I think, from just more volume. And then some of those volume programs started to come in and people were talking about small love and 5x5, and people were just getting jacked on those because they actually did much more work. So on overload for volume, Westside doesn't score all that well usually.
I think it's important to consider too that there's probably people who are watching this that are saying, Well, dynamic effort days are high volume, 10, 12 sets of 2 or 3 reps, or that the assistance work being done after the max effort work is high volume, that it's the repetition effort method. And the idea that dynamic effort work is high volume, we're looking at 36 total reps, 12 triples at 60%, compared to the type of hypertrophy work that I'm doing, that I'm prescribing to my athletes, that's less than half what a lot of people are doing, and they're doing multiple sessions of that a week. So while it's relatively high volume compared to a max effort day, it's still in the grand scheme of volume, it's very low. In regards to the assistance work being done for high volumes, I know that they'll be doing 5 sets of 10, 5 sets of 12, 5 sets of 15 on assistance work. That's all well and good, but assistance work, machine work, all that is going to be less disruptive, not cause the same levels of muscular damage, and thus not cause the same levels of hypertrophy as doing higher volume barbell work in the primary, in the competitive exercises and their variations.
Well, what about strength development? There's another critique. So it's similar in the critique of, so that's just from a lack of volume from a hypertrophy perspective. How do you develop the best general strength? Lots of sets per week, all of that 70 to 85% 1RM range. So Westside takes care of that 85 to 100% 1RM range really well. They do as much work as they pretty much can in that, it's not much. And then they kind of usually miss that 75 to 85% range kind of altogether, and the rest is from 60 to 75%. That's where speed work is, and that's where most of the assistance movements are. How do you develop a ton of strength in your legs if you're missing out on that 75 or 70 to 85% range for multiple sets of like 5 to 8 reps or 3 to 8 reps? Like that's where you're really, really, really strong. So in a sense, the Westside system is designed for pretty decent levels of hypertrophy you could potentially get through just a ton of assistance work, and then a lot of peaking work, and there's not much general strength development in between. So it's kind of a missing piece, I would say.
And I think it's also important to note with that if you have athletes using sports supplements, they may be able to get away with less volume of work and still developing significant musculature.
Or keeping musculature they brought into the sport from other sports.
Yes. So the third principle is going to be fatigue management. Fatigue management, which you can go more in depth with in my other video on this topic, is going to be about, are you doing enough work or are you doing too much work? So enough work to drive progress, but not so much that you're unable to recover and going into a state of overreaching, of non-functional overreaching, and potentially overtraining. And this is something that where Westside does do a pretty good job, is in fatigue management. And having the heavy session and the light session or dynamic effort session each week allows for very strong fatigue management.
So the dynamic effort training, the selling point there for a long time was that it's speed work. It developed good velocity. It's not specific to the velocities of the actual executed lift, so I'd say that as far as speed work, it's not very effective. And also the bar velocity of something like benches and squats and deadlifts is actually very low compared to dynamic lifts like pulls of various sorts, Olympic derivatives. So it's not the speed work that's good about Westside, but it's the fact that you have a super overloading max effort session, and then after that, before your next max effort session, you have the speed work, which really is not very voluminous as we talked about, and it's very light. So it allows you to recover really well for that next overload session. So the fatigue management is pretty great. You can count on, for most lifters, every time you are about to do another max effort workout on Westside program, you're going to feel pretty good going in. You're usually not accumulating a ton of fatigue. A problem with that is because it's insufficiently overloading, it's not sufficient volume. But because of that pulsatile nature of the program, fatigue management is pretty good.
Area where Westside could fall down in the area of fatigue management is that because of the nature of constantly maxing out, and particularly when you add in the component of mechanical overload movements, whether that's partial range exercises or very high accommodating resistance, going into 120, 130, maybe 150% of the athlete's actual 1 rep max, then you're going to be developing very high levels of neural fatigue, and the neural SRA curve is going to be the longest. So even though you're maybe not beating up the muscular systems as much, the joints are going to take a lot of stress from constant maxing out, ligaments, tendons, as well as the nervous system.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that's not really a critique for what Westside was really designed for and thrive for, which is equipped lifting. In equipped lifting, there's no choice. You have to do accommodating resistance because that's the nature of the program. You have to get 110% on your back because in the competition you'll get 120% of your raw max on your back. But when people try to incorporate too much of the accommodating resistance and the mechanical overload exercises for their raw work, they end up, can they still recover because of the heavy and light day structure? Yes. But the thing is that their effort to fatigue ratio is super high kind of for no reason. Like instead of doing 3x3 banded squats and then calling it a day because that's enough neural fatigue for you to have to recover, why don't you do 8x5 and just raw squats, get a ton of benefit, but for the same amount of neural fatigue. You can still recover next time you do it. It's just that overload, the mechanical overload, that accommodating resistance, it's worth the trade-off of high fatigue for equipped lifting. For raw lifting, because it doesn't have the same carryover because of lack of specificity, it's just not worth the overload. So it's not really a huge knock on fatigue management so much, but it's like, why are we accumulating all this fatigue neurally and for joints when we don't have to, when we can instead do other kind of much more specific work?
Which is limiting the actual total volume of training that the lifter is going to be able to do. So they're going to be training well under their MRV, which training under your MRV is a positive for fatigue management, but training too far under it is going to be a negative for overload.
For sure. And then one more situation where the fatigue management, this is a relatively minor critique, but it's such a big part of the Westside way of doing things that we probably have to mention it. The use of sled dragging for GPP development. GPP in some really big sense is always sport specific. GPP doesn't mean you just go out and play basketball or walk your dog. It's a general preparation for, in some sense, that sport. So a GPP for tennis players is going to look different. GPP for swimmers is going to look different than GPP for powerlifters, for example.
Especially when we take into the context of where the athlete is in their career.
Right.
Because if you're 5 years old or 6 years old and you're getting ready to be an Olympic weightlifter when you're 20, then basketball and swimming are going to be great GPP.
Yes. Yeah, once you're an Olympic weightlifter, maybe sets of 5, sets of 10 in the squat.
Yeah.
And the same thing, for sled dragging. So one advantage of sled dragging is supposedly GPP, which it's way too general and doesn't transfer remotely into lifting. And the other hypothetical benefit from Westside perspective of sled dragging was it's supposed to reduce fatigue. It's another workout that's supposed to reduce fatigue. Could you do better than that? Yes. So it is technically maybe a light session, which is good. It might reduce more fatigue than if you rested completely. Not so convinced about that. A lot of guys work pretty hard on dragging the sled and end up at just fatiguing more. They could have just been better off at home resting. And in another sense, why not do more light lifting? You get more technique work, more practice in the lifts, and you drop the same amount of fatigue. So if you're really looking for a good recovery session as a lifter, whatever you bench, squat, and deadlift, chop that weight to 1/3 of what it is and work on your technique and your setup. You're bored someday at home and you want to go work out, but you have a big workout in 2 days, go in, put 135 on the bench if you're a 275 bench presser, and do triples with the most perfect arch and setup ever. A couple triples, do some really light work, go home, you'll recover better, and everything will be great. Sled drags, what exactly in powerlifting remotely looks like a sled drag or involves those systems? I'm not really sure.
Yeah. So if you're in terrible shape, is it going to have some benefit? Sure. But are there better things you can do? Most definitely. So the next point is going to be SRA, Stimulus Recovery Adaptation.
The Westside system does very well for especially the lifters who have benefited the most from it, on whom many of these ideas were essentially developed and propagated. Larger, very muscular, very strong lifters take a really long time to recover between heavy lifts. And Westside does a really good job of, first of all, taking the weekly structure and spreading out the sessions. Westside doesn't like Monday you squat, Tuesday you squat, Wednesday you squat, Thursday you die. Okay, so they spread out all the lower bodies, spread out relatively evenly, upper body sessions spread out relatively evenly, makes sense. And because of their heavy light structure, light days or max effort and dynamic effort days, it does a really good job for larger and more muscular lifters of making sure that you have a distinct stimulus, max effort day, you have a distinct recovery and adaptation period, even with a little pulsatile dynamic effort day to help recovery along, and then you come back and hit it again. So really, really good on that structure. Some programs the first time I ever saw a Westside template, it made total sense. I was like, okay, you're doing hard here and easy here, and then you repeat. It made perfect sense. Sometimes you look at programs people write, it's like I squat today, tomorrow I deadlift, then I do front squats, and then I do stiff-legged deadlifts. You're like, when are you healing? Right? It doesn't make any sense. So Westside does that really well, but on the bad hand, it's for smaller lifters and for female lifters who tend to recover much faster.
And novice lifters.
And novice lifters that are just starting out. they can't do that much damage, or their body's ability to heal damage relative, so the GI tract size, for example, relative to how big their muscles are, is way off scale. They can recover much faster. They can neither hurt themselves much or disrupt physiology much, and they can also recover much faster. If you wait an entire week to train your lower body hard, and you weigh 132 pounds and use your first 2 years of lifting, you are waiting exactly 6 days longer than you should be, probably. So there's in the Westside, it was at some points got a little bit dogmatic, where everyone runs that same idea of a template. How many times a week do you squat with Westside? Once a week, right? You squat heavy once a week. And if you say, hey, look, I feel like I could squat much more often because I'm healed, like the next day or the day after, nope, you gotta wait. Right? And that's a problem with SRA, because we're pissing away a lot of time, and maybe even just getting slightly worse if you've come from another system that higher frequency.
And if you're saying, well, why don't you just add in extra days, higher frequency training? That's fine, and you can definitely do that. It's just that if you do that, my opinion again, what you were doing would cease to be Westside. It could still be a conjugate system, a concurrent system, but it would not be Westside as has been outlined in so many articles.
Sure.
So the next principle, variation, in some ways is Westside's strongest area. With a weekly rotation of max effort exercises or every other week, it's very, very unlikely that any athlete gets stale, that they either become mentally stale, like bored in their training, or stale in the sense that they've been doing the same exercise and same set and rep schemes so long that the results are going to cease.
Yeah, and for a lot of really boring powerlifting programs that during Westside's heyday competed with it, this is a huge advantage. They're like, hey, what are you doing again? Triples, high bar squat. What are you doing next week? Triples, high bar squat. What are you doing the week after? Triples, high bar squat. Or how about this? A program named after a single set and rep range. What are you doing? 5x5. Really? And then, in traditional 5x5 execution, oftentimes it's just the low bar squat. Sometimes maybe the high bar squat, maybe front squat, but usually just low bar squat, 5x5, 5x5. That stuff gets really old. Westside, what it brought to the table that was awesome is, I guess the credit goes to Louis, who crafted Westside, is probably the understanding that we're hammering this huge amount of overload with these crazy heavy lifts. How do we sustain this continual heavy training? Well, you change the angles a bit, you change the lifts, and then the exact same structures aren't getting taxed just the same way. So for example, if you tried a high bar squat to a heavy single once a week and you were that big or whatever, you were using accommodating resistance, maybe your knees would start acting up because of those same joint angles being used all the time. Now you use a high bar squat one week, wide stance squat another week, a totally different set of structures as limiting factors. Not only is that much less boring, but also you're hitting something different, and it actually helps from a fatigue management perspective where you're not beating up the same structures all the time. So that's the good news. Staleness super unlikely, right? But Chad, what's wrong with too much variation, perhaps?
Well, just see specificity. If you're changing exercises every single week, you're going to inevitably use exercises that have a very low transfer to the lifts. As Mike was mentioning about avoiding staleness and always having new exercises, and we're going to get to this more in our next point, the idea that the athlete is going to adapt and fail to make continual progress if they don't change exercises weekly or every other week or even every other month. The only situation where that could really be feasible is in the absolute most advanced lifter, where their abilities are so high that they're going to adapt quickly to exercises, but the degree of variation that's being made, I think Westside makes too broad of variations, things that get too far away from the competitive exercise, where if we were to high bar squat, front squat, low bar squat, wide stance, narrow stance, those are all still very similar to the competitive exercise, where they're going to have a high degree of specificity and a high degree of transfer, but they're also different enough from the competitive exercise where they're also going to help avoid staleness and avoid adaptation, accommodation to
adaptive resistance.
Yes.
Yeah. So Westside rotates, I guess, whenever every week or more or less, you try a new movement, and at some point we're failing to sum up abilities in any one particular lift. So you ask somebody who is very religiously so dogmatic about Westside, how's your deadlift? I haven't actually deadlifted in 5 months. Okay, how do you know for sure that you're working the underlying systems responsible for deadlifting? Well, I've been doing this, I've been doing that. You're gonna hit a PR on good mornings, I hit a PR on rack deadlifts, I hit a PR on stiff-legged deadlifts. Are we smashing the same structures enough to where they're not just going, oh, something bad happened, I need to get stronger, and then it doesn't happen again for months as the same lift doesn't rotate, and they go, oh, it's okay for me to get weaker. The way you get stronger is a sequential overload with specificity to make sure, okay, front squat, front squat, front squat, then your body's like, you know what, I'm never going to get weak at front squats again, because I know they're still coming, and then you can move away for months from front squats, and you hold on to more of those adaptations. A lot of people got frustrated with the Westside system because they PR all of these variations, which were great in their own right, and they would come to the competition lifts and there seemed to be no transfer of training at all, sometimes negative transfer of training where it was such an alien lift. You know, powerlifting is a phenomenally simple sport from the broad perspective of all sports. You got 3 lifts to get good at. A big part of that is doing those 3 lifts. You know, we would make fun of a weightlifter that never did snatches and clean and jerks, but in powerlifting, I guess maybe it's okay to never squat, bench, and deadlift. You got to do those things a lot, and especially sequence and summation. And there are skill components to those lifts, especially in a peaking phase. When you get close to your meet, you had better be used to benching. The last thing you did before your meet is not even bench. You did some kind of stuff to boards. When you start trying to touch in that shirt, all hell's going to break loose. You're going to not have any kind of neural wiring to make sure you're doing that properly.
And are there lifters out there, advanced lifters who have been successful with the Westside system, Matt Wenning, let's say, who knows what exercises, even though he's rotating every week, knows what exercises transfer well and is able to track his progress on those and understands how it corresponds to his competitive lifts? Definitely. Are the majority of people who are trying to use Westside systems and are most likely beginner, maybe intermediate lifters, able to do that the way that Matt Wenning does? Almost definitely not. So our next point, phase potentiation, is, along with specificity, probably the biggest criticism of Westside style training for the raw powerlifter. They really don't have any good in regards to phase potentiation because honestly, there is no phasic structure to a Westside system. That's sort of the nature of conjugate and concurrent training, is that you're trying to develop all the systems at once, and that's just not the ideal way to do things.
The way to best develop underlying abilities in any sport is to at least give them some kind of focus on their own for some time, raise them up. They usually, just fact of human physiology, that systems are much easier to maintain than they are to expand. You know, it took you tons of struggle to learn how to ride a bike, but you come back to riding a bike for a week, even if you haven't ridden one for 10 years, and you're as good as you ever were. In a large sense, that's the case with things like hypertrophy and general strength and peaking abilities. So with Westside, there is really no hypertrophy phase to speak of. If you want hypertrophy, you add it to your strength work at the end, which you're so beat up from your strength work, how much hypertrophy work are you really going to have left in the tank? Especially, not just after, because people think, okay, I do my heavy singles and triples, then I add some volume at the tail end, and I'll be good. That adds my hypertrophy. But in the real world, what are lifters going to think? They're going to think 2 things, especially experienced lifters. Yes, I can add the volume at the tail end, but I want to heal for my next max effort workout. If you're still sore on your legs because you added too much volume, your next max effort workout is going to go very poorly indeed. So just adding stuff in isn't probably the best way to do things. It's probably a good idea to get away from heavy training for a little while, do higher volume training sets of 6 to 10, somewhere in there on average, then go through a strength phase to strengthen that new muscle. The lengths of phases can be, you know, anywhere from several weeks to several months. It's very much up for debate, very individual. And then transition into a peaking phase. The thing is, Westside's kind of like a permanent peaking program where you're always in pretty good shape, you're always peaked to compete, but in some sense, because you're always peaked to compete, you give up that preparatory phase. If you want to be the best at any one thing, you have to see it as a series of systems with underlying components. You have to make sure to improve those components. A really brutally simple analogy is if you're really good with something you do on your computer, digital design, or you're a writer, and the Windows refresh button for improving your computer keeps popping up like, hey, we need to update, you need to update. Is it going to cost you time to click update so your computer has to restart and all that crap? It takes 15 minutes, it's annoying. It's going to take you time, totally. Is it going to reduce your efficiency right then and there? Yes. So like if you take a hypertrophy phase, are you going to be stronger right at the end of it? No, you're going to be weaker, especially if you're advanced, right? Because your neural patterning changes and now you're good at 10s instead of good at triples and singles. That's a problem, but in the long term, if you do hit that update button, your computer runs faster, more efficiently, gets fewer viruses, and then you get more work done. So in the long-term systemic approach, it is worth to go through those dedicated phases. Those phases pretty much just don't exist in Westside, and that's a trade-off. You're always going to be pretty good, but you're sacrificing your long-term abilities for that.
So to add to that, one of the things that Louis really makes us a big proponent of Westside is that the lifters are always ready to compete. But you have to remember that you don't really need to always be ready to compete, because you know when your competitions are and you can set your training up for that. When they start throwing surprise competitions at you, then maybe you're going to always need to be ready. And as Mike was talking about the long term is critical, because if we just take 12 weeks of phasic structure versus 12 weeks of Westside, are we going to develop hypertrophy that much more, general strength that much more, peaking that much more in such a short time period? Probably not. The differences are going to be negligible. But as we look at cycle after cycle, year after year, potentially decade after decade of a lifter's career, creating a phasic structure within the training is going to be so much more effective. So even though in 10 weeks or 12 weeks or 20 weeks, you may not be seeing a huge difference in hypertrophy, and you think, well, Westside may be stronger this month. It's not just about 1 month, it's about the long term. And another common criticism that Westside proponents have made of phasic structure or more linear programming is that you're always moving away from the quality that you previously developed. So you do hypertrophy, and then by the time you get to peaking, you have lost all your hypertrophy. And that certainly could be possible in a poorly designed program. But a properly designed phasic structure is going to have sufficient volume through the general strength phase to maintain hypertrophic gains from the hypertrophy phase, and sufficient volume in the peaking phase to still retain those as well. And obviously, if you make the phases you make your peaking phase too long, of course you're going to lose hypertrophy. But we're talking about optimally designing programs, so you're not going to do that.
Yeah, and you're never, in the emphasis phases properly designed, you never move completely away from those qualities. You're still going to be taking some heavy lifts even in a hypertrophy phase.
Yeah.
You're going to be doing some hypertrophy work in a strength phase. You're going to be doing plenty of strength work in a peaking phase, it's just the priorities change. But when Westside, the priorities never change. Is it a huge critique? No, because phase potentiation in the grand scheme is one of the least important training principles. It's not like if you don't do specificity, I mean, you're totally screwed, right? If you don't do overload, you're totally screwed. Phase potentiation is a minor critique, but here's the thing. A minor critique over, like Chad said, over a year, and you total maybe 5 or 10 pounds different, okay, whatever. Over 10 years, 50 or 100 pounds different, maybe 200 pounds different, that takes you from rank 1 powerlifter to what rank? 200 pound total difference at 198, let's say. What does that take you?
Oh, 100 places different,
Yeah.
200
So there
places
you go.
different.
Yeah, everyone's really close. So,
Yeah.
okay.
So the final principle is individual differences. Westside does a great job here because of the very, very high variation. There's an exercise for everything and for every problem.
Yeah, if you have poor flexibility in your shoulders and you can't high bar squat or you can't low bar squat, it's not a problem for Westside. You just pick a different exercise and you're running and gunning. If you have to work around an injury, tons of exercise to pick. Because the brutality of specificity, like if you have a weightlifter, for example, and they can no longer snatch or clean and jerk because of an injury, holy crap, that's really bad. With Westside, you can work around damn near anything, which is a very big positive of the program. And some people just respond better to some exercises. Like some people, they'll do skull crushers, their triceps will blow up, everything's great. Some people, their skull crushers just hurt their elbows. For them, close grip benches are the way to go. With Westside, because of the huge exercise potential, you can pretty much rotate anything you want. You can pick all your moves that work best for you. And there doesn't have to be like, well, you're a weightlifter, you're going to front squat. Well, I hate front squats. Well, too bad, you're not a weightlifter anymore then, right? So Westside has a huge potential there. Downside is on 2 points. We already mentioned in SRA one of these downsides, individual differences. If you're a smaller lifter, if you're a beginner lifter, if you're a female lifter, Westside is not sufficiently frequently overloading, and that's really a bad deal, especially with some of the tapers that are designed in Westside programming. They'll pull all heavy lifts, 2 to 3 weeks out, and a whole week of not lifting leading up to the meet. Okay, if you're a 132 class female lifter, you don't lift for an entire week leading up to your meet, especially if, let's say, you've been training, and I've seen stories like this, training 1 or 2 years. You legit have technical breakdown in your lifts because you're so out of practice. Like I knew people who had last heavy deadlift 3 weeks out of competition. They show up and they're like, oh my God, like where the hell do I put my feet? Everything feels weird because these lifts have to be practiced, especially early in career. Now, if you're gigantic, if you're super strong, like most of the guys at Westside, or pretty much all of them, and you've been training the powerlifts for 10 years, 15 years, are you going to forget your deadlift setup over the course of 3 weeks? Hell no. And you also need that time to drop all that fatigue. But with no adjustment, everyone, and the real question is this, I was going to mention this earlier, people say, well, you can modify Westside. Is it still Westside? This is a really easy test. arrange with Louis to come to Westside, and he'll say, okay, so this is what we're doing now. And you'll be like, yeah, Louis, I'm not doing that, and I'm actually going to come back tomorrow, if that's okay, to do another extra workout that I developed by myself, and you tell him your reasoning for it. Good luck, right? That probably won't fly, which means it's probably not Westside,
Yeah.
right?
So if you want to add, if you add this extra frequency in or higher volume or shorter tapers, and you're at Westside and Louis tells you to do it, then yes, that's still Westside. But if you're making those decisions for yourself outside of those walls, then you're probably going outside, still maybe doing conjugate or concurrent training, but not doing Westside anymore.
Right. So last critique we have, so there's the SRA critique for not adjusting frequencies, and the last critique we have on Westside is MRV critique. So like working up to a heavy triple or heavy single for really large muscular developed folks that take a lot of fatigue, that may be right at their MRV, as much volume as they can handle and still recover from. For smaller people, less advanced people, for female people, they can just do so much more work. So however you put the work, if you put it on the back end of all the days, or if you improve the frequency, so not only is there an SRA problem, there's an MRV problem. Westside, for folks that are not very strong yet, for smaller individuals or ones that haven't trained for a long time, is not that hard of a system. It doesn't push you. I've known people that have switched from Westside, people on the smaller end usually, or beginners, to squat every day and just blown up. Their squat shoots through the roof. And Westside guys go, how the hell can they recover from that? Well, if you squat 800 pounds, can you usually squat every day and survive? Almost certainly not, right? You're gonna pay really big for that. But if your everyday squat is 50 or 60 kilos, 130 pounds, can you squat every day? Can you accumulate this enormous amount of volume or set number and still recover? You bet. So because Westside has relatively set and rep schemes, it's just not going to be enough work for most people, and there has to be adjustments in our program to optimize that ability.
Thanks for watching our critique of Westside for the raw lifting. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you're going to be able to critically think and evaluate what you're doing with your training, why you're doing it. I'm Chad Wesley Smith.
Dr. Mike Israetel.
Please subscribe to the channel.